Can we call ourselves to order so that we can start the session? Thank you.
But secretly.
Thank you. Okay, so this session, our final session on the Millennium Development Goals beyond 2015. Millennium Development Goals have been, I think it's fair to say, hugely influential in shaping an agenda both for donors and for governments of developing countries. And it's time for renewal. Renewal is an opportunity to rethink, and there's a process going on around the world of rethinking right now. Now's our chance to have our input into it. Indeed, David Cameron, the Prime Minister of Britain, is one of the three people tasked by Ban Ki-moon with that job of rethinking. We've got as good a panel as any you could assemble on Earth for this topic, I think. James Foster really barely needs an introduction on the subject of measuring poverty and the dimensions of poverty. He's director of the Institute for International Economic Policy at George Washington University, but of course he's famous for the index of which he's the first initial. So thank you for coming, James. Paul Gluey used to work with me in the World Bank at the research department, is now professor of applied economics at the University of Minnesota, and again, there's a long history of work both on the practical aspects of beyond things like expenditures on primary education or number of kids in schools, how much gets into kids' heads, so beyond the obvious measures, the more meaningful measures, and also a huge amount of stuff on malnutrition, inequality, poverty. And finally, Charles Kenny, now a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development and a specialist in the role of technology in measuring the quality of life. And I think one of the really exciting punchlines from Marcelo's talk on Monday night was the power of new technology. You know, we can know the poor by name now, and we can measure many dimensions of poverty that until recently were beyond reach. So we're going to take it in order, and James, you kick us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Whilst James is just setting up, let me say tweets as usual. Hash CSAE 2013, and I'll be reading the tweets.
Hello. Hello. Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. It's really great to be back here at Oxford. My themes today will be threefold, actually one main one in the middle, measurement, but the first will be just lamenting the type of official data that we have available for conducting these sorts of exercises. I think it's something we can all agree upon, so I really don't have to spend much time on it. Secondly, discussing new ways of measuring the kinds of things that we'll be needing to measure. And then finally, giving a few examples to illustrate why these measures might have traction. Well, data underlying the MDGs are over 48 indicators from various sources, including census, occasional surveys, administrative data. There are a number of big problems with the data. For 38% of countries, there's no trend data for 2/3 of the MDG indicators. It sounds pretty serious, doesn't it? For 70%, or a little less than half of sub-Saharan African countries, no household income or expenditure survey in more than 5 years, although this should be rectified to some extent soon. For 19 countries of East Asia and Pacific, data on 125 a day, poverty was lacking for all of that group, and data on malnutrition was available for just one country. And as of 2011, a little less than half of the 163 countries don't have data points on either side of 2000, so both sides of 2000. So, Francois Bourguignon has been very good in discussing the data problems. In particular, has stressed that improved data gathering and its quality in all countries should be the central focus of what has been going on right now up to the 2015 and beyond. And a report, MDG's report 2012, has stressed the urgent need for improving the quality and reach of household surveys. What's the consequences? Well, consequences in terms of credibility. You said that so many MDGs have been met in this country or that, and so on and so forth. Well, if you don't have data, what does that really mean? Second, accountability. If you're trying to hold countries accountable to what you are seeing in the countries, or the world accountable, that would certainly be limited by the lack of data. So clearly the proposal, which is really a non-proposal, everyone is behind this, it's straightforward, there's no argument. You have to have more data. It would be probably quite straightforward to consider a very simple household poverty survey, a short one that would get many of the dimensions that would be of interest, and it could be more cost-effective, because right now money is being paid to many, many, many parties to gather the data that are being used in the Millennium Development Indicators. All right, measurement. Measurement is the lens through which those data are processed, and therefore progress is revealed. Currently, we have a dashboard of indicators with no summary measure at all. The justification is pretty straightforward. I mean, you can't throw together apples and oranges and expect to get anything out of it. But there are obvious drawbacks of dashboards, as pointed out in the Sen, Fitoussi, Stiglitz, Sen, Fitoussi Commission, as communications instruments. One frequent criticism is that dashboards lack what has made GDP a great success, the powerful attraction of a single headline figure, allowing simple comparisons across time and space. Now, this isn't just marketing, folks. This is serious business, because having that kind of an instrument facilitates engagement, monitoring, good governance, as governments know that people are going to be looking as to what's happening, and therefore accountability. And this was all discussed recently in a pretty interesting blog article by Duncan Green, in which he talked about the traction that's being, how can you get countries to do that which should be done, and using the so-called league tables to compare countries that are in similar circumstances. Dashboards are also notoriously bad for coordinating things, okay? You preserve inefficient silos, so that I'm responsible for this one dimension, and that's it. I don't have to look at all the other dimensions. And another group is responsible for this. And you don't ever get into discussions until someone drags you into it on synergies and trade-offs. This is emphasized in the discussion below, which says there are important synergies among the MDGs. If you do well in one, it may in fact have a big impact on being able to do well in others. These synergies are what could be behind a more efficient way of addressing the kinds of deprivations that are underlying the MDGs. So given these synergistic and multiplier effects, all these goals need to be given equal attention and be achieved simultaneously. This requires multi-sectoral approaches and coordination among various implementing agencies, which is not being facilitated by a dashboard. Perhaps there's room in the discussion for a multi-level evaluation instrument that can do certain things. First, it might be able to identify and prioritize households with overlapping deprivations that are multiply deprived, that can be aggregated and disaggregated to whatever the policy needs are at the household level all the way up to the country and global level. Offer a high-level summary indicator for communication and monitoring, but at the same time have along with that, and as part of it, joined at the hip, as it were, dimensional indicators in a coordinated dashboard to facilitate policy analysis and the kinds of coordination necessary to make things happen. that it can be transparently tailored by countries if they don't necessarily agree with all the priorities. They would like to change one or to move it around a bit based on what they need. Create their own instrument, which then could be compared to the central instrument in a transparent way so you know why it's different and why it's changing perhaps differently over time. This could create greater ownership and traction. And finally, bear in mind this has to be used with some pretty minimally effective data. It can be quite crude data that is categorical or ordinal data that's used in the standard Millennium Development Goals. In previous rounds, the previous round, no such instrument existed. It just wasn't out there. But countries have been exploring alternative poverty instruments, ways of measuring poverty, that started back in 2006 with Mexico. And these approaches might well be adapted into this context. The question they were addressing was, how do you evaluate poverty when there are many variables or dimensions of well-being? And these are many variables that cannot just be mashed up into one overall well-being indicator. So the background papers for this discussion are a few that I have with Sabina Alcair, several which she has with Maria Emma Santos, and then Sabina has one with Andy Sumner recently on the MDGs, one with me a long while back, and again that blog with Duncan Green. So let me give you an overview of this type of methodology. We've gathered together the way that people have been doing this and incorporated it in a series of papers. The structure of this measurement of poverty in the present case, but it can be expanded to many other things that you need measured. The main structure is first identifying who's poor, or who you're looking at, by means of two cutoffs, two forms of cutoffs. The first is a deprivation cutoff. Are you or are you not achieving in a dimension? If you are, great. If not, you have a deprivation in that dimension. Now this can be conceived of at the household or individual level. Look across the second dimension. Cutoff, deprived, not deprived. Third, fourth, fifth, etc. The first type of cutoff is a deprivation cutoff. Now, having identified the various deprivations that an individual may be suffering at once, we then evaluate the extent to which this multiplicity of deprivation is existing. If it's enough, if the breadth is wide enough, we have a second poverty cutoff, which if you're above it or equal to it, you're considered to be poor. If you're below it, you're deprived in some dimensions, but not poor. So that's the way that poor are identified in this simple approach. Second, the aggregation is conducted using a variation of the FGT index. It reduces to that standard approach to measuring unidimensional poverty when you have just one dimension. So we're back again in the standard FGT. The key measure that's used, however, is called the adjusted headcount ratio, which is the product of two basic indicators. The first representing incidence of poverty, so it's the percentage of the population who are considered poor by this identification approach. And the second component is the average breadth or multiplicity of the deprivation that people suffer at the same time. That's called the intensity. Multiplying the two, and that's the adjusted headcount ratio. The concept behind this is that poverty is multiple deprivation. It's a Senian approach. Poverty is being seen as multiple deprivations in some underlying capability space, in my picture of things. Data usually makes it so you don't have capability, but functioning or some vague approximate. And this approach of identification mirrors an approach that's used by lots of NGOs. It depends on the joint distribution. If you're just deprived in one, then you're not poor, let's say. If you're deprived in many, and you have to know many by looking at the distribution across people, right, then you're considered to be poor. It's able to be defined for ordinal data. So if you have dirt floors versus covered floors, It can distinguish, and you say one's deprived, one's not, fine. It's really converting qualitative data into quantitative data by dichotomizing, the way we often do with poverty measurement. And if you have all the setup, the variables, the deprivation cutoffs, the deprivation values, since different deprivations could be valued differently, and the poverty cutoff, then someone else can come along with that same data set and repeat what you just did. And in fact, they could change some of these values to see whether it's robust. Consequently, people stay honest. And it can be implemented at several levels, including cross-country with the MPI, within countries, within states, and even at the local village level, which has been done in a number of countries for villages within the countries, for evaluating particular projects or programs, as a coordination tool, which I'll get into in a second, and in constructing all sorts of other measures which create indices where there were just missing dimensions before. I don't think I'll do that for you, okay? We don't need to talk about matrices, do we? How many vote for matrices? Okay, we have some math lovers. No, I'll continue. The idea of the adjusted head count is that it's analogous to the usual poverty gap measure. The poverty gap can be seen as the head count times the intensity, the depth below the cutoff in an income space, right? Averaged across the poor people. So that I, the intensity there, is multiplied by H to get the poverty gap. Instead, we can't measure depth. These are ordinal variables very often. And so we have to somehow combine and see how multiply deprived in a breadth approach a person might be. And then we take the head count times that indicator of intensity. One or two of the interesting properties of this approach is that it's decomposable by group, so you can bring it all the way up to countries in the world and all the way down to the individual regional level. But more than that, it's decomposable by dimension after identification. So if you know who's poor, you can then figure out how poverty is relating to deprivations within each of the dimensions of the poor. The H there, called the censored head count ratios, they are the percentage of the population who is both poor and deprived in J, the dimension J. And so take a look at that percentage, average it across all dimensions using whatever the value of each dimension's deprivation would be, and you get M0, the adjusted head count ratio. So you can tear it apart, put it together for the kinds of purposes of communication, and tear it apart for further and more in-depth analysis. So that's what I just said. The MPI, as an example of this, is constructed of 3 dimensions. But really the subdimensions or indicators is where we're looking at. Each one is given a value, if you look in cross dimensions, equal value for health, education, living standard, much like with the Human Development Index. And then within those, another equal division, a nested approach to evaluating deprivations. This is available for many countries. It comes out every year. It just came out 2 days ago, in fact, with the last, or was it yesterday, with the last update, 2013. A person is considered to be poor if they're deprived in a third or more of these dimensions. So we're aggregating, applying a value to each, and then looking to see whether you reach the cutoff or not. In this case, race is reaching the cutoff because of assets, electricity, water, toilet, nutrition. The MPI is that same formula we just mentioned. And you can see it compared to the $1.25 a day, various ups and downs. The small comment there just is saying that the data quality are in fact not particularly inferior to the $1.25 a day. The country that it's pointing to there is Nigeria, and so we'll see Nigeria given here in the graph of Sub-Saharan Africa. This is the breakdown of the MPI and the recent results in terms of regions within countries. So you can see the inequality in this poverty measure within countries. And you can see over time what's really running the show here. Great improvements in sanitation, not so much in electricity, the one immediately to the right. But actually it's different at different levels, because if you divide Nigeria up into different regions, we see that south is doing well in all, pretty much. Down means improvement, lowering the censored headcount ratios. But north central, so there's south-south, north central has moved back in terms of electricity. A different picture of what's happening within that region can be ascertained. Example, Colombia. They've used this approach to coordinate ministries in order to achieve maximum poverty reduction. This has been created in 2011. The official poverty measure was put together by this group. Here is what it looks like. It has 5 different dimensions, and now notice this has been implemented at the country level, based on country needs. Notice formal work is indicated in the middle. Informality versus formality. If you are an informal, you're considered to be deprived in that dimension. Also, overcrowding in terms of housing is a big policy issue in Colombia. This has all been included into the poverty measure. And we see results where we have declining poverty according to these measures. And here's the picture I wanted you to see. That's the president leaning over to all the ministers, the Minister of Health, Labor, Housing, Agriculture, Education, and Finance, who are all accountable for their censored headcount ratio that is associated with their ministry. There's a graph which indicates targets for them, much like something we're talking about here. And the goal is to lower overall poverty a certain percentage in the next 4 years or 5 years. So it becomes a way of coordinating among some usually not very easily coordinated individuals to achieve a common end. Finally, or example 3, forgive the 2, governance. Mexico has created, they were the first to create a multidimensional measure, and they use income, come back to me, income as well as various so-called social rights given in the Constitution. A person is considered to be poor if they're cut below the income level and have any social right not being achieved. So there is the graph of poverty in Mexico. It's indicating where people are who are poor. But of course, if you want to look at it spatially, you can see it here. But what I wanted to show you was this graph. In this graph, we see that the social deprivations have been, in fact, improved. They've been lowered by Mexico over the time period 2008-2010. You remember that period. It wasn't a very happy period because of financial aspects. And so it's not too surprising that you see income deprivation or poverty rising during that period, and associated with that, because it's probably unemployment, food security has been diminished. So the overall picture was an increase in poverty. Now, I mentioned governance, didn't I? Well, it turns out that the government of Mexico and, by the way, the various states could explain well to the people of Mexico, we're doing our job. Here's a problem that's occurring. You know that's an external and a very important problem, but here's what's happening. Here are the ways that we can understand the increase in poverty over this time period. We'll continue to try to do our job, maybe by raising certain limits with oportunidades and so forth. But this is the facts, we're sticking by them, and they're rewarded for the good work they do in the short time period before they're thrown, they're not in office again. That's the problem. Final example, I guess, I'm running over. I'll just mention to you what it does. This example is the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, put together by USAID, IFPRI, and OFI next door. And the idea of this is to reveal missing dimensions of poverty. Yes, again, we have this dimensional approach to constructing an index. Now a specially constructed survey was put into the field in 3 countries. Women were asked by women, men were asked by men. Both genders were asked about their various empowerment dimensions. Do you have input in productive decisions? Do you have autonomy in production? Do you have control over your income? Are you a member of a group and do you mind speaking in public? How about your time? Do you have free time or not? Very natural dimensions to consider for empowerment. Who's empowered? Someone who has 80% or more of this. Disempowered if not. And then the measure is constructed over the left-hand side, 1 minus M0. So it's a measure of empowerment, not disempowerment. So it's 1 minus the M0 we constructed for poverty. I will mention that we also have 1 minus P1 to the right-hand side for a relative gender parity index, which compares my measure of empowerment, my level of empowerment, to my spouse's. Okay? And so the poverty line is my spouse's, and if I'm above it, I'm not considered disempowered. I'm empowered relative to my spouse. The Bangladesh results are given here, and it's been rolled out in another 17 countries. So my proposal is pretty straightforward. Last slide. Design a multi-dimensional instrument that can do this. Identify and prioritize households with overlapping deprivations. Aggregate and disaggregate to your heart's content. Offer a high-level indicator and also a consistent lower-level indicators for further analysis. Can be tailored by countries and can be applied to the actual data out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. That was superb. You've reconciled we've avoided the perils of the dashboard. We've got a single high potential, high impact number like GDP, but it's got the diversity within it that makes it meaningful and credible, and it's got the flexibility that allows individual countries, individual governments, individual regions to tailor it to their own. That's a super advance. Thank you very much. Let's turn to Paul Gluey. Paul, the floor is yours.
Hi. Before I started my presentation, which is going to be at least fewer slides, if not shorter in time than James, I wanted to explain how to pronounce my last name, which is Glevy, not Gluey, okay? But hopefully you'll remember more than that from this presentation. Okay. Well, that's just the opening introduction there. I don't think you really need to see that. So, as you probably know, there's 8 Millennium Development Goals that were supposed to be achieved by 2015. I'm going to focus most, as the title on the previous slide said, on the education goals, because most of my research is on that topic. But I'll make a few other mentions here of a couple of things. So here they are. They were proposed in the year 2000, but actually they went back to 1990, so to go from 1990 to 2015. I actually looked yesterday at there's a website that you can check, and I was surprised to say that for the first one, reduced poverty rates, the $1 a day or $1.25 per day, they said, yeah, we met that goal already. And I think what happened is that poverty went down a lot in China and to a lesser extent in India, and so that kind of outweighed maybe what happened in a lot of other countries. But the 2 goals that focus on education, and I'm sure Charles, you're willing to do the other. If James talks about number 1 and I talk about 2 and 3, you can do 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 in the next session here, or next talk. But I want to talk about education. It's pretty simple what they are. The first one is that all children should complete primary school. And the second one is that there should be gender access or gender equity across all levels of education. I'm going to show you some numbers about these, okay? So that's what I'm going to focus on most of the, basically almost all the rest of this talk on, okay? Actually, let's talk about the gender equity one first, because that one it seems like things are going pretty well. So I looked at 2 different things, or 3 different things, and because I didn't want to show you all 150 countries, I'll just focus on the regions for most of my talk. And first of all, by primary completion, you see that for boys and girls, or male and female, it's pretty similar across East Asia and Pacific and Latin America. not quite so similar in the Middle East, and then in South Asia and more in Sub-Saharan Africa. It's not pretty close, but I'll come back to the general trends in completion in a couple of minutes, but at least at the primary level, it doesn't seem like there's these big gaps. But if you go to the secondary and tertiary levels, some gaps emerge. So I've kind of highlighted in colors the gaps. The first one, which is kind of surprising and the opposite of what you expect, is that in Latin American countries, actually, there's a lot more girls in the post-secondary or tertiary education than there is boys, so that's why you have the 125 ratio. I'm assuming that that's okay, that we don't want to like say that's bad, that we have more girls in tertiary than we have boys or men versus women, but I don't know, somebody might object to that. But then if you go down to South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, clearly there are more boys or men who are going to those levels of education than there are women or girls. So basically, the gender equity goal seems to have been met for the most part, but there are still some gaps at higher levels of education in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And actually, there's one subtle thing, and that's why I've highlighted the number 88 here, although I haven't checked it very carefully, which is that these secondary and tertiary numbers are actually ratios of girls enrolled and boys enrolled. And in South Asia and some other countries, there are lots of gender imbalances basically due to sex-selective abortion. So you could have 100% of girls and boys going to secondary school in South Asia, but you're never going to get that number to be 100 because there are simply more boys than there are girls at that level. So I don't know if people were thinking about that when they made these goals. If they had just expressed it in terms of enrollment rates, it would be fine. Okay, but the message here is that I think the gender gaps are sort of doing pretty well, except in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa at sort of the higher levels of education. So that's good. What about primary completion? Well, some people might say, let's look at the primary enrollment rates, but in fact, that would be a little bit misleading. If you look at for the year 2010, the primary enrollment rates in all the regions are 100 or higher. So it looks like, oh, we must be meeting that goal. But it's kind of misleading because, first of all, these are gross enrollment rates. They're counting it's a ratio where the numerator is the number of children who are enrolled in that level divided by the number of children in the age range associated with that level, okay? But in many of these countries, children repeat, or there are kids over age who are in there. So, for example, I remember years ago in the 1980s or 90s in Cote d'Ivoire, the average kid who completed primary school 6 years had actually been in school for 9 years because they repeated 3 years, okay? When you have a lot of repeating, you can get ratios that are over 100 or equal to 100 and still have a lot of people who are not going to school. So you'll see in a second some numbers that sort of show that maybe things aren't so great we don't have universal primary completion. The other thing to sort of notice in here is this is the one graph where I've shown trends, and the trends are all pretty positive, that both at the primary and secondary levels in all regions, the enrollment rates are going up. So that's good to see. Although again, for Sub-Saharan Africa, at the secondary level, and to a lesser extent South Asia, they're kind of low, okay? But if we just focus on primary completion, what we really need to look at is this next graph here. And you'll see that actually it's not looking so good in the Middle East and South Asia, and definitely not looking very good in Sub-Saharan Africa. And you might say, how can that be because of those 100% enrollment rates? But it's because of repetition and overage children being in school that kind of inflates the enrollment rates. But there's still roughly 1/3 of kids in Sub-Saharan Africa don't complete primary school. So we're definitely not, although the trends are good here, we still have a long ways to go. And if you think about it, it takes about 20 years to go from 51 to 67. If we just draw a linear line through that trend, it's going to be 40 years before we get to 100. Okay, so that's kind of a long time to wait to get to full primary completion in Sub-Saharan Africa. So there are problems here. I mean, things look better. Well, they look very good in East Asian Pacific and Latin American Caribbean. They're improving. If you, again, do kind of a linear trend for the Middle East and for South Asia, basically within 20 years, things should be close to 100%. It'll be 40 years at least for Sub-Saharan Africa if you just sort of do the linear trends. Okay, so then I wondered, well, which countries are doing well and which are not doing well? So this is all the sub-Saharan African countries where I could find information on. I took out a couple of small island countries because I didn't want to have too many on here. And I also took out some of the countries that there were no data. But they're kind of all over the map. If you look at Zambia, it's 103. I put an exclamation point behind there because I don't understand how you can get over 100 with primary completion, but it has to do, I think, with data sources. But 103 is probably pretty close to 100, okay? I mean, how can you get 103% of kids finishing primary school? Unless they're like immigrants or something, I don't know what. But other countries are doing very well. Ghana, 94%, Botswana, 97%. These are really the top performers, Tanzania, 90%. But then you look at other ones and they're very low. And a couple things to highlight here without folks. Oh, and just the other thing is that there are 3 countries I'm surprised there's no data. I mean, why is there no data for South Africa? You know, or even for Kenya or Zimbabwe? I don't know, it just wasn't there when I looked these up a few days ago. So let me make a few comments about those sub-Saharan African completion rates. The first is actually something that I haven't checked very carefully, but I'm pretty sure I'm right, which is that if you look at these numbers, the former French colonies kind of do worse, okay? You know, Burkina Faso, 45, Chad, I think that was a former French colony, I'm not even completely sure. Cote d'Ivoire, 59, it might say, like, what's going on in Mali and things like this. Well, actually, it may be a little bit misleading because I know that for Cote d'Ivoire, back when I was working at the World Bank on Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, that you had to actually, if you weren't performing very well in school, they didn't let you go to the next grade. You had to repeat grades. And I was saying a minute ago, the average kid in Cote d'Ivoire who finished 6 years of primary school had actually been in school for 9 years because of this repetition, okay? So what's going on here is that they're holding kids back. They don't complete primary, but the flip side of that is that the ones who do complete primary, they probably have actually learned a fair amount to get to that point. Where it's not so clear, and I'll show you some evidence later, that for former English colonies, that they're learning a whole lot when they complete primary. So just because you have a low primary completion rate doesn't mean everything is bad. It may be, at least for some of these countries, that we're actually making sure that the ones who do complete actually learn something. So that's the first comment on these. The second one is that, going back to the previous slide, the sort of second worst region, South Asia, 86% primary completion. If you look at the sub-Saharan African countries, there were only 5 or 6 that actually did better than South Asia. The other, I don't know, 35, 40 were worse. I listed there. I said 5 or 6 because I don't know for sure that South Africa is above 86, but I'm pretty sure that it is. But I didn't see any, couldn't find any data for that. The flip side of that is that, you know, there's a lot of these countries who are really doing terrible, below 50%. I didn't check the trends for them, but I have a feeling that even if we go to 60, 80, 100 years, they're not going to, at the present, they're not going to achieve universal primary completion. So that's kind of the bad news. So those 2 MDGs, Millennium Development Goals, I think for gender equity in education, things are looking relatively good, but for primary completion, there's sort of a big problem in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, but unfortunately, that's not the only problem. The last point on this slide, how much are they learning? I'm not talking just about Africa, but everywhere. How are they learning? And probably many of you have seen these internationally comparable tests. There's actually 2 of them. The first one is in this slide. This is called the Pisa Test. It's mostly OECD countries, but they throw in some other ones too. The Pisa Test has been run every 3 years or so since the year 2000, maybe even before then. I didn't put it up here, but you'll see it in the next slide. For the way this test is designed is that a score of 500 is sort of what the developed countries are mostly getting, and some of them are above 500. And it's each sort of standard deviation in the distribution of test scores is 100 points. So if you're at 400, you're sort of 1 standard deviation below what you would be in sort of the developed countries that are supposed to be getting 500. They actually are getting 500. So what this shows here is that for almost all of these developing countries, I didn't put South Korea up here because they're like way off the map on 600. You'll see that in a couple more slides. But for the ones, these developing countries, they're not learning nearly as much. These are for 15-year-old kids, so they're basically in secondary school, in the middle of secondary school. They're quite far behind. And if you look at one of the worst ones, Peru is way below, although I guess the good news in Peru is that the score is going up from 2000 to 2009. So sort of, although even in other regions, like if we go to Latin America for primary completion, looks great, 102%, we're done. There's a lot of evidence that they're not learning a whole lot. Although in some of these countries the trends are good. But on the other hand, in other countries the trends are kind of flat or sometimes even going down. So, if we had set a Millennium Development Goal of increasing the learning in school, we wouldn't be doing very well, because some of these countries are doing okay. Chile's going up, Indonesia's mostly going up. And that's one I highlighted there. But other ones are kind of bouncing around. So that's not very good. Now, the Pisa test, that's where this is from. There aren't any sub-Saharan African countries that participate in those tests. But there's another organization, and I'm not quite sure why there are two of them, the TIMS and the Pearl, that do math. Actually, for the Pearl, that's the reading part, and the TIMS is the math and science part. There weren't any kids who were doing any sub-Saharan African countries that participate in the reading. So I'm just going to show you math. So here you see that South Korea and Japan are doing very good, and because I'm from Minnesota, and we always think we're above average, it just turned out that for some reason they had a number for Minnesota, so I put it up there. I'm glad to see that we beat Russia, at least by 6 points. Although they have more advanced, they have 14% advanced students, we have 13%. But then USA and England, around, for USA, England, and other developed countries, it's around 500, okay? And within these categories, there's sort of the really great, students at math, and then there's the ones who are not so good. So if we don't look at the superstars, but just look at USA and England, maybe we have 7 to 8% who are in the advanced category and 8 to 12% who are in the low category. That low category is pretty low. So I put the definition up here. That was the last thing I did for the slides before I sent them over here, which is that what does a score of 400 correspond to? We're talking about 15-year-old kids who are in grade 8. Students have some basic mathematical knowledge. Students can add and subtract whole numbers. Think of that. A kid in grade 8, add and subtract whole numbers. No multiplication, no division, just adding and subtracting whole numbers, no fractions, no decimal points. Okay, that's a pretty low standard, okay? And then you can read the rest of the definition, and to recognize familiar geometric shapes, okay? For those very low, those are people below 400. Those are the ones who can't even do this, okay? So that's pretty bad, but it's going to get worse. So let's look at some developing countries here. There aren't that many in these data sets, so there's Thailand, Chile, and Indonesia. They have, scores about 1 standard deviation lower than the US and England, but if you look at how many advanced students, there's almost none, okay? The very low, the people who actually can't even get to the point of adding whole numbers, much less multiplying them, it's like 1/3 to 1/2, okay? So that's not very good in terms of achievement. Now, I did show you before that Indonesia is getting a little better over time, okay? Especially in the reading part. Math is a little bit slower, but it's not a huge, rapid increase. And then there are only 3 African countries that participated in this. Okay, Ghana, Botswana, and South Africa. Let me remind you that these are the really top performers in terms of primary school completion. Ghana was like 94, Botswana was, I think, 96 or something. Actually, let's go back and take a look. Yeah, Botswana was 97. South Africa, I don't have a number, but I think it's pretty much close to 100. Ghana was 94. These are the top performers in getting kids through primary school. Okay, how are they doing in terms of test scores? Really bad, okay? And in fact, for Botswana and South Africa, I don't know why, but they're tested 9th graders instead of 8th graders, okay? So they had even a little bit more of an advantage. But look, 79% of the people in Ghana in grade 8, couldn't do very basic things in math. 76% in the South Africa. Botswana, in some ways, might be not so bad, 50%. I mean, if you think of Indonesia, I think in some ways it's a very successful country, and they're doing better than Indonesia, at least in that category. Botswana is. But still, it's pretty appalling how much little it is that they're learning. So a lot of you probably have seen this already. Some of you maybe haven't. But getting kids through school, completing primary, even with the so-called top performers, there's a big hole here that needs to be filled. And for those of you who are familiar with my research, I'm trying to figure out what can we do about this, okay? It turns out it's really complicated. I've been trying to figure out for 20 years, a lot of other people are, and we can all agree that it's pretty complicated. So let me wrap up here with a few comments. I mean, it's easy to say it's complicated. I can say that for all kinds of things. But the good news, I guess, for the MDGs is that the gender equity goal has been met. We probably still need to keep monitoring in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And if the trends continue, maybe in Latin America, we need to have gender equity goals to benefit boys instead of girls. But I'm not going to worry too much about that. 100% primary completion, the other MDG in education. In some areas, it's mostly met, and the trends look good, but in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's a long ways off. Okay. What should we do for MDGs in the future? I would say two things. The one which I kind of pulling out of the air is that, okay, if we're getting everyone through primary, why can't we set a goal of getting them through lower secondary, about 9 years of schooling? Because I think a primary education is still going to leave you in a pretty low state. You know, going back to James' presentation, he probably thinks of primary as maybe pushing you into the poor side, whereas maybe lower secondary gets you out of it. But the real important thing is my last point here, which is that we need to sort of set some standards for learning, okay? Getting everybody through primary school when they actually haven't learned a whole lot is not a really high bar to cross, and it's a misleading bar in many ways. And as I pointed out, for the Pisa test, there were no African countries and only a few other countries. And for the TIMS, there were 3 African countries. We really need to be collecting this kind of learning outcome data for all these countries, okay? So I'm basically agreeing with James that we need a lot more data out there. I'm not really sure, I know these are sensitive issues because countries don't like to look bad. A few brave ones are willing to go out there and have their students be tested. And there's a couple other, there's a sect up in another thing in Sub-Saharan Africa where they've done some testing. But we need kind of to collect this kind of data, and it may be a sensitive thing. I know that when the results came out for Mexico like 10 or 15 years ago, they refused to let them be published because it was so embarrassing. And I think they don't participate anymore in some of these things. But we need to kind of, this is I think the MDGs we need to set for education in the future to look at learning outcomes. Now, I'm not saying that then we're all done, because then you might say, okay, that's cognitive skills, what about non-cognitive skills? But we'll save that for maybe 10 or 15 years from now. If we can get these cognitive skills up, you know, a lot higher than they are now, I think, you know, the quality of life in developing countries would be a lot higher. The sort of embarrassing thing is that despite my and many other people, you know, trying to understand what we can do, we're still just scratching the surface on what kind of policies are really going to raise learning in developing countries. So we have a lot more to do, and I'm happy to hear that there's a lot of interest in this kind of research, but I can tell you from experience that it's really complicated trying to understand why some kids learn and other kids don't. But that's what I want to be doing, and I hope a lot of other people want to do that as well. Okay, so that's my last slide. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. I think, Charles, I think you don't have any PowerPoints, is that right? So we can all reassemble on stage.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Paul, and thank you to you all for being here. You know, I'm honoured to be the sort of, last speaker in the last session. Although perhaps the whole sort of conference was aimed around, you know, descending order of quality. So, it's certainly undeserved for me to enjoy that honour, as I'm not a real economist. I certainly don't have a PhD, and nor am I really an Africa specialist. On that second one, I was slightly reassured because I spent most of today, I had 3 full talks today, and one was on Indian social violence, another was on Indian education, and the third was on the Philippines and the political business cycle. So I guess I'm not the only one who doesn't focus purely on Africa here. But it is true, I really am not a genuine economist, and one of the reasons you can tell, look, Ma, no slides. Anyway, so what do I actually want to talk about today? As I don't have a slide saying, I better tell you. I want to tell you why I think that Africa has been abused and maltreated and misjudged by the current MDGs, and how we're about to do it all over again in the post-2015 development agenda. Just as one more throat clearing, I do see I'm the third speaker in a panel of 4 white men talking about development goals that are largely aimed at developing countries, and this actually is a real problem going forward, and I think one of the reasons that Africa does get maltreated by the MDGs. Deb Bhattacharya did a literature survey and estimates that 90% of the literature he could find on the post-2015 development agenda had been written by people sitting in the global north, if you will. And I think that, that is a real problem that we have to address for what are meant to be global goals. But anyway, as I say, enough with throat clearing. I've added to that imbalance, of course, writing a few papers, trying to sort of measure development progress as might have been predicted based on historical trends and looking what happened in the MDG period, and then using a similar technique to say, well, where might you expect the world to be in 2030? And so what are plausible stretch goals to stick in the post-2015 development agenda? I don't want to talk in detail about those papers, but I do want to pick out some implications for Africa and post-2015 in particular. So look, at the global level, as Paul mentioned, we've seen some really heartening progress towards the original set of MDGs. We did meet the poverty, income poverty goal 5 years ahead of schedule. But a year or so after the actual original Millennium Declaration in 2001, a decision was sort of made that the MDGs applied at the country level and applied from the period 1990 to 2015, and thereby was Africa really set up for failure, because now every country in every region were meant to meet what had previously been global goals. Now, the UN's latest report on the MDGs, they come out with one every year, suggests that Africa is on track for just 1.5 of the MDGs. It's on track, as Paul mentioned, for the gender equality goal, at least at some levels, in education. And it is arguably on track for the improved water supply goal. When it comes to poverty reduction, school completion, child mortality, maternal mortality, combating HIV and malaria, the MDG report gives Africa a fail. But what accounts for this failure? I think, first off, it won't come as news to anybody in this room. The 1990s were a pretty grim decade for Africa. Actually, the proportion of people living on $1.25 or less a day between 1990 and 2000 in Africa went up. And thanks to the AIDS crisis, life expectancy and mortality flatlined. It actually dropped in southern Africa. And the region, sort of already lagged Asia and Latin America in development progress. The 1990s just put it further behind, cemented Africa in last place. The 2000s, as we all know, were different, right? It's been a great decade for Africa. The proportion of people living on less than $1.25 a day, and yes, the statistics are awful, but dropped from, according to the World Bank, dropped from 58% to 48% just between 1999 and 2008. Life expectancy climbed by 4 years. World Bank estimates say that the proportion of children who die before their 5th birthday in sub-Saharan Africa, this based on DHS data, so a bit more reliable, fell at more than 4% a year between 2000 and 2010. Progress at that rate is enough to cut mortality by 2/3 over a quarter century, which is the MDG target. But sadly, that dramatically improved performance was too late for Africa to be able to meet the MDGs. Because despite the fact they were agreed in 2000 and codified in 2001, they said this is about progress between 1990 and 2015. What were already really quite optimistic goals for country-level progress over a 25-year period were, pretty much Herculean goals for 15 years, which is all that Africa really had, given 10 years of stagnation. And what were Herculean goals for the average country over a 15-year period were simply unbelievable and impossible goals for a region that started so far behind. Take child mortality. Patterns of historical change across countries suggest that a 2/3 reduction in child mortality was likely to take, on average, around 40 years rather than 25. And the MDG was for 2/3 reduction. Experience prior to the Millennium Declaration, of the 109 countries for which we have data, only 33 would have met that goal of a 2/3 reduction between 1975 and 2000, the quarter century before the declaration. And only one of those countries that managed a 2/3 reduction began the period with a low GDP per capita and high mortality. So the child health MDG was an ambitious goal for the planet, a very ambitious goal for the planet, one we are not going to meet. But for Africa, especially given the lost decade of the 1990s, it wasn't even a stretch goal, it was simply implausible. Look at income. If a country has median incomes a lot below $1.25, it is a lot harder to halve poverty over any given period than it is if your median income is quite close to $1.25. Work by Mark Misselhorn and Stefan Clausen argued that in India, because it started with a median income quite close to $1.25 in 1990, each 1% change in mean incomes would reduce the headcount poverty by 0.55 percentage points. For Zambia, which was a good deal poorer than India, the same increase in growth, rather than a 0.55 percentage point reduction, it would only reduce poverty by 0.39%. Because Zambia was just, the median income in Zambia was just too low to make it easier to move a lot of people over the $1.25 threshold. Now, thanks to very rapid growth in India and the larger poverty impact of that growth, India is actually almost on track to meet the goal of reducing poverty by half between 1990 and 2015. It may miss it by a couple of percentage points. Zambia's poverty rate actually increased between 1991 and 2006, largely, admittedly, driven by an atrocious growth record. But even had it had a good growth record, it would have been much harder for Zambia to achieve the trick of halving $1.25 a day poverty than a country like India. Now, enough African growth in the 1990s might have put more African countries in the sweet spot where it was easy to halve poverty. But we've seen that didn't happen. That gave Africa a scant 15 years to turn things around. And actually, some countries have been making impressive strides, of course. Tanzania, the poverty headcount fell from 85% to 68% just between 2000 and 2007. Great news. But like the child mortality goal, the poverty MDG just set Africa up for failure. In 2004, already, the World Bank was estimating that the typical African country would have to grow, on average, for at least 7% a year for the 15 years between 2000 and 2015 in order to halve poverty rates. In the world as a whole, between 1985 and 2000, only 5 countries managed to sustain that growth rate. We're asking every African country to do, the very edge of historical precedent in terms of growth rates in order to get Africa meeting the MDGs. And perhaps particularly egregious in its anti-Africa bias was the MDG that Paul talked about. Every country needs to get every kid through every year of primary education. Now, we have made, as Paul points out, a lot of progress towards that goal. But in 2010, more than a third of 132 countries for which we have data were at below 90% completion. And most of those countries were in Africa. Burkina Faso was at 45%. Now, 45% is not great, but in 2000 it was 24% completed primary school. Burkina Faso, compared to almost any historical precedent, has been chucking kids into school and getting them to complete at an incredibly rapid rate of progress. But it doesn't matter. The MDGs take Burkina Faso's success and say, this is an utter failure. I say all of this as a supporter of the MDGs, who quite like to see a successful post-25 development agenda emerge. I actually do believe that the MDGs have not least played a role in motivating aid flows. Indeed, since the late 1990s, aid flows on average have gone up about $50 billion a year. The interesting thing about that number is the early costing studies for the MDGs. How much would it cost to meet the MDGs in terms of extra aid flows? Suggested a number around 50 billion. And actually, maybe partially because of our aid, we have seen globally more rapid progress than you might expect on the basis of historical trends in areas including global health and getting kids into school. Global child mortality, for example, is sort of lower than might be expected on the basis of historical trends at the country level. It was at sort of 5.1% in 2010. You might have expected it on the basis of historical trends to be around 5.4%. Doesn't sound like a big difference, but over years and over the entire planet, that adds up to some millions of kids who aren't dead and millions of parents who don't have to face the pain of burying their kids. I think it is vitally important progress. And in further defence of the MDGs, it's not like Sub-Saharan Africa has been punished for its slow growth. We have seen increasing aid flows to the region. But I do think by branding Africa a failure in this rather egregious manner, the MDGs do play into the traditional stereotype of the region as a basket case, somewhere that's way too fragile for trade or private investment, where you can throw aid at Africa, but it won't have a very big impact. Goals are good. I really believe goals are good, especially as a motivation to assistance and other pro-development policies, but they really need to be realistic if they aren't to have negative side effects. And the MDGs were most notably not realistic for Africa. And that experience matters right now because here we are about to talk about the post-2015 development agenda and everybody's running around coming up with new goals. And in particular, a lot of people are getting excited by the idea of zero goals. The original MDGs said half poverty, now we'll say no poverty. If the original MDG said 2/3 reduction in child mortality, now we will say no easily preventable child mortality. The same for maternal mortality, the same for sanitation, the list goes on. A lot of people have jumped on this bandwagon. In this year's State of the Union address, President Obama said the United States will join with our allies to eradicate extreme poverty in the next 2 decades. He added that the US would join in efforts to save the world's children from preventable deaths and realise the promise of an AIDS-free generation. David Cameron suggested in Liberia, when he was at this high-level panel meeting on the post-2015 development agenda, that he was in favour of at least some of the zero goals. And the appeal of these goals is obvious, right? I mean, who can be against zero poverty? Who can be against wiping out preventable child mortality? But the risks should be too. Africa is the region with the highest mortality and poverty. Set zero targets and they are most likely to be over-ambitious for Africa. And it's already very clear that a number of the proposed targets would indeed be incredibly ambitious for Africa. Optimistic growth forecasts still suggest that Africa is likely to have between 205 million, 100 million people living on $1.25 a day or less by 2030, for example. Based on historical trends, Sub-Saharan Africa will have a child mortality rate of about 6.6% in 2030, more than twice the developing country average, and way above the floated zero goal, which is actually 2%. The UN, by the way, is predicting a higher rate of child mortality than that. They're saying it's going to be 8.5% in Africa. Zero goals are more ambitious than the original MDGs. And the original MDGs, on the most generous interpretation of their impact, did not speed progress by anything close to what is being suggested by the zero goal supporters. It is possible, perhaps, that we could bend the curve in some of these areas. Take the poverty goal. If we actually manage to set up a reasonably efficient transfer system, maybe we could wipe out $1.25 a day poverty. But in other areas, the kind of curve bending we're asking for is really worthy of a spring factory, not of economists. Take under 5 mortality. even if the countries with the highest under 5 mortality in 2010 halved mortality between 2010 and 2020, and then halved it again between 2020 and 2030, 28 countries would still miss a zero goal of 2% by 2030. That's a 3/4 rate of decline over those 20 years, more ambitious than the MDGs, and still 28 countries, mostly in Africa, miss the MDG zero goal, a future zero goal. It's about twice the rate. 3/4 is about twice the rate that can be expected based on historical progress. So it's just incredibly fast, and still a whole bunch of countries, even if they went incredibly fast, would be branded failures by the MDGs. Now, I'm not saying we don't have the technology to achieve these goals. We have universal sanitation, we have very low rates of mortality, and we have effectively $0.25 a day poverty in a whole bunch of countries around the world. It's not that. It's to improve outcomes in those countries furthest away from those zero goals at the rate proposed. It would take a combination of financing growth and behaviour change and institutional strengthening and so on and so forth that has rarely, if ever, happened so rapidly in the past. And frankly, in a lot of cases, we just don't know what it is or how to do it. So if we're going to bend the curve that dramatically, most importantly, it's going to take unprecedented zeal in African countries to deliver a range of services far better than ever before. And again, I'm not sure we have much advice to offer in terms of speeding up process that fast. But also, let's be fair, surely it should take an unprecedented and doubtless costly new global effort. And that's not just about more aid. I mentioned that the MDG costing studies suggested 50 billion would get you the MDGs back in 2000. We're not meeting the MDGs, so it's clearly not just about more aid, it's about much better aid. And it's clearly about a lot more than aid too, isn't it? It's clearly about not just trade reform around tariffs, but trade reform about non-tariff barriers and agricultural subsidies. And it's not just about investment and debt relief. It's about dealing with the $50 to $284 billion a year that rich country firms profit shift and tax avoid out of developing countries. And it isn't just about giving more money to the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunizations. It's about intellectual property right reform that allows cheap cost generics in developing countries. And it's not just about sending a few more consultants out from the Adam Smith Institute to advise on health reform. It's about real meaningful migration reform that allows a lot more people from low-income countries to migrate temporarily or permanently to Europe and the United States. But sadly, one thing that has not accompanied this glowing discussion of zero goals and incredibly stretched targets is anything about what this global effort will look like or who will pay for it. President Obama's inspiring language at the State of the Union has not been accompanied by similarly uplifting budget requests for USAID. David Cameron, in his defence, has been backing 0.7%. But one, he hasn't really talked much about the link between 0.7% and any new round of zero goals. And two, I can assure you he's talked nothing about migration and trade and finance reform that would need to go along in order to promote the kind of growth rates we're talking in Africa. You don't need zero goals if all you're interested in is targeting assistance on those furthest behind. You don't need an end date when they should have caught up to some zero goal either. Goals with targets and timeframes are to push performance from the ordinary to the stretch. And they will fail in that if it rapidly becomes apparent that they are just completely unreasonable goals, if they're fantastical targets. So until we see evidence of dramatic new aid flows and policy changes in the rich world, I think the rich world members of a high-level panel, at the very least, ought to shut up about zero goals. And my plea would be to keep the fantasy out of targeting when it comes to the post-2015 development agenda, especially for the sake of Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So now it's over to the audience. Let me assure the panelists, most of our audience you can't see. I can read some of the tweets. So let's start with one of our unseen audience. And it's a challenge, especially to James and Paul, I think, that both of you really urged the need for much more data, but you also both demonstrated that we haven't even got much data to measure the things we're trying to measure at the moment. So is there a tension? I suppose it's sort of pointing to Charles' point. By demanding the ideal, are we just setting ourselves up to fail? So we're going to take two questions from the resident audience to add to that tweet, and then we'll run along the panel. Yeah, Bilal. Take the microphone.
So thank you very much for a really interesting set of presentations. I had one very small question and then a couple of larger questions. The really small question is, in terms of the international testing scores, Paul, I have no idea how sampling is done for these kinds of things, but it seems to me quite likely that who you sample is highly correlated with what country is being sampled. And so my guess would be that in poorer countries, and for example, even in places like South Africa and so on, you're actually getting the better off kids because you're just much more easily able to access them relative to maybe getting the average student in, say, England. So that's just so maybe this is just actually even a very conservative bound on how bad things really are. Mm-hmm. My bigger questions are mainly to Charles. So you spoke really convincingly about how the goals are unrealistic, but what I didn't sort of understand, this is a purely naive question, what are the consequences of missing the goals?
Yeah.
What's the harm, in a sense? And I'm not saying you should set silly goals, but I'm wondering what's happening now. Are people pointing fingers at each other? Who is being blamed for this? Are there responses or reactions to countries that miss the goals? Will they be better targeted for aid? Will they get more aid in the future? How are these things actually working out, given that you're as much a Washington insider as anyone? I'd love to know what you think. And the second issue is also kind of related to this. What's the counterfactual? I mean, your colleagues have done a lot of work on this. Would the world be any different if these goals had not been set? Would anything have been changed? Would anything have been different? I mean, we had a very lively discussion a couple of years ago about the Millennium villages and whether a Millennium village was any different from the average village in Kenya, and apparently it's not. And so why do we think these goals even matter? Thanks.
Thanks, Bilal. Let's take something from, yeah. Okay.
Thank you very much for a fantastic presentation. I'm Katsu Shima from University of Manchester. I have one specific question for Professor Foster and the general question to all. So after the Rio Plus 20 conferences, so the interest of the UN member states have been rapidly shifting to the sustainable development issues and MDG has already got a goal like CO2 emission as MDG 7, but many argue that it's too general. I think James' proposal based on MPI is fantastic, but do you have any idea of incorporating some aspect of sustainable development into MPI or MDP in the measure? And also another point is that the data requirement is quite high. Although you got 100 data for 100 countries, I think it's basically based on the demographic health survey data. So I think that it would be probably better to propose that the simplified version of the demographic health survey kind of thing to the countries for which the data not available. So how would you think of that process. This is the second one. And the general one is that on post-MD issues, so the recent article by Professor Fukuda Pao in World Development this year has argued that it will make sense, particularly to Africa, to look at the change of the goals, not the absolute level, so either in the relative change or absolute change. So if you look at the change, so Africa actually did quite well. So how would you think about the proposal by Professor Fukuda Pao?
Thanks very much. James, would you like to kick us off?
Yes, so we can't do what we set out to do because we don't have data. We need more data now already. So there's no problem with my statement, I presume. We need more data. Now, if you want to go a step further and try to collect information that would lead to suitable new goals, you may need more data in different dimensions, and all we're suggesting is that you collect them all in the same place, which is what any welfare economist would suggest. So I'm not going too far from my training when I say that. Now, I agree that there are trade-offs and there may be other data sets that can't be collected as a result. That is a big global public good problem that I don't really want to get into too far here, but I agree with the questioner and hope that we're on the same side in that respect. Sustainability, of course, many dimensions of sustainability can be conceivably collected and incorporated at an individual level, others can't. And so there are some dimensions of, obviously with cooking fuel is getting some part of that in the inside of the house, and that there's internal pollution in the house. That's one really interesting question. But I'm just saying in some dimensions you can do individual base, but as far as a broader definition of sustainable development, much more has to be done. I have not conceived of putting together within that context the MPI, but that's a really great next step. My colleagues are at OFI, I presume, right now looking at that question. As far as the relative versus absolute, that is one of the main discussions in all of measurement. What's the baseline? What is your comparison set? Should it be relative or absolute? And I agree entirely that that's extremely important as a way of making sure that people feel that they can achieve goals. And that's an important part of this whole process, is to make sure that the goals that are put out there could be achieved realistically. Otherwise, it's just totally empty.
Sure. Is this turned on? I guess so. As far as the first question that you read, Paul, it wasn't very clear to me what the question was, but the cost of collecting data is much less than the cost of actually this program. So I don't see any cost reason why we can't collect a lot more data. So maybe I misunderstood the question, but I don't really see.
I think the implication of the question was that if we add more sophisticated needs for data, is that just going to amplify the problem that we don't even have the data for the simple goals? That's really the point.
Well, yeah, I agree that we need to get, completion rates for some of those countries that we don't have them, but I think the next step is to get data instead of on learning and more generally to the things that James wants to collect. So we just have to go one step at a time, but the costs are really not very big compared to the money that's talked about in these things. The question about sampling, these are representative samples of the schools, but what that means is that if the kid is not in school, they're not in the program. So in some sense, that means it's kind of worse than it looks, because all those 15-year-olds who are not in grade 8 or not in school, they're not in there, and I'm pretty sure their test scores would be lower if they had been in there. And then the point about changing using relative goals instead of absolute. Actually, I think they're kind of relative. Some of them are relative, like having poverty or reducing malnutrition by 2/3 or something. That is kind of a relative goal already. So they're already kind of a mix of that. But I agree with Charles that for the absolute goals, they really were set up for Africa to fail, because they were already behind, and they set these goals, in the year 2000, and they moved them back to 1990, and from 1990 to 2000, Africa was having a lot of troubles, and so they were making it even harder for them. So you got to be careful. I think from now on, we should set the goals from today forward, not from 10 years ago forward.
The question about what are the consequences of missing the goals, and would the world be any different without the MDGs? The honest answer is, I don't know. But let me try and say a bit more on that. We haven't yet, at least I haven't yet heard the line, well, you know, Africa got $1 trillion, whatever it is nowadays, in aid over the last 6 years. They can't even meet the MDGs. But I'm waiting for it. It will pop up. It feeds into a narrative which has, you know, Africa as the basket case, and I think that narrative needs to stop. When it comes to would the world be any different without the MDGs? So in a paper that would not pass muster with 99% of the people in the room, so I don't want to talk about it too much, we try to at least go through the kind of the causal chain, if you will, or at least post hoc ergo propter hoc chain. There was a Millennium Declaration, aid flows went up. Aid flows went up in particular to health and education sectors. Based on a simple model of what you'd expect from historical progress, we saw slightly faster progress than you might expect globally in health and education. Ta-da! It's not a strong argument idea. Now, I do think you can say about some particular aid flows that may have been influenced by having a Millennium Declaration out there. There really is actually a closer link. So, money that went to Gavi really did lead to a lot more measles vaccinations being handed out. When you look at the cutoff just above Gavi eligibility, countries just above that cutoff have lower measles immunization rates than countries just under that cutoff. So, you know, it's plausible that Gavi actually really did have an impact on immunization rates. Higher immunization rates really do seem to have led to a lot fewer kids dying of measles. Fewer kids dying of measles helps you towards the under 5 mortality goal. So, you know, on the margin, I think for at least some aid, some of the time, we can start making a case there. When it comes to, you know, the much bigger non-aid agenda, I'm lost and I give up. Just on the levels and trends, relative and absolute things. My problem with zero, beyond the fact that they've set Africa up for failure if they're low, is actually they weaken the MDGs as a tool for targeting. Because if you set very low zero goals, basically you can give money to any country and say, yeah, we're meeting our MDG commitments. Or you can do what is basically a rather bad bilateral trade deal with Libya and say, we're helping meet our MDG commitments. The over-ambitious goals also have when they are levels goals, also have the unintended consequence, I think, hopefully unintended consequence, of kind of making everything count in a way that is actually really unhelpful.
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with a tweet which actually puts a question to our audience, in particular to the many Africans in our audience. So I'll pose the question and you're going to have to answer it. You can answer it with a comment that throws back a question if you like. But the question is, do many of the African economists here think that the new MDGs as proposed will be relevant to the policy dialogue in their country? That seems to me a pretty good question. Think about it, tell us, and throw a question back. So whilst you're thinking of that, there's another tweet really challenging the composite indicator. So it's very much a question primarily to James, but it says, is there a danger that a composite indicator conceals rather than reveals what's going on? And especially if you are allowing flexibility, does that actually allow countries to, in effect, to manipulate that index so that they look good? Then you get a question from the chair, which is an abuse of the chair, but here goes. All of you are very much focused on what I would think of as floors to living standards, you know, in a broad sense. That's what the existing MDGs are about. Mm-hmm. and you're sort of enriching those floors to living standards, and that's a sensible thing to do, but there's a debate out there as to whether we need to move beyond floors to living standards. Brazil is very much leading the pitch that we need to focus on environment, on natural assets and liabilities, and should we be basically moving into goals that concern, if you like, the stewardship of nature. And then if you actually turn to one region of the world where ordinary people recently spoke up, the Arab Spring, what was the Arab Spring actually saying? Was it saying we want higher cognitive skills in education? Or was it saying what we want is jobs and justice? In which case, should something along the lines of jobs and justice find their way into the MDGs? Because neither was there in round one. Now, we've got, now is the chance for the Africans to respond to that challenge. Doesn't have to just be the Africans, but you're invited. You're on the spot. Yes, and there's a volunteer straight away, right at the back.
Okay. My name is Ebele from Nigeria, Ebonyi State University. I think coming from Nigeria or from Africa and living there, to me the issue is not about the size of the goal, moving it up or moving it down. Is basically the problem is on the quality of intervention. I think over the years, the quality of intervention has, depreciated. So the intervention process is now inbuilt into the political process. In other words, you have a direct correlation between the quality of intervention and then the quality of leadership. So as long as the leadership structure remains weak, you don't expect improvement in the intervention process. And that's, of course, why it looks like the goals are not being attained. Thank you.
Thank you. Lady down here.
Thank you very much. I'm Aisha from South Sudan. I'm Aisha Rahim from South Sudan. I just wonder, the way how you put all African countries, as if there is no differences between giving chance with country like South Africa, which have very high level of development, with the country like Botswana, which is just a small country relying on the South African rand. And then again, you add some country who just emerged from conflict. So I think this measurement a little bit need adjustment. So the African countries can be really ranked according to the level of development, according to the political commitment. All these things has to be really taken into consideration. So I agree with him. There is something need to be done. And also we need to take part in this kind of things. As an African scholars, I think we have to give this chance to also express our things. Thank you very much.
That was clearly one of the problems with MDGs Mark I, was they came from on high down rather than from people up. That's why I introduced the Arab Spring, as it were. But yeah, so we've one more. Yes.
Thank you, Augustine Fosu, UN University Wider and University of Ghana. I'm not sure if I'll be answering your questions, Paul, but I'm wondering whether indeed the use of the word failure is appropriate. In part because the goals can be flexible. As you're indicating, you can move them up or you can move them down. So why should it be categorical? Why can't we use some type of a continuous measurement? And we can talk about how close a given country is to the goal. And we should give marks to the country, whether the country meets that goal categorically or not. My second point, I know that Paul earlier concentrated on the completion of primary school and the gender goal. He also mentioned the progress that African countries have made on the poverty goal, although he didn't emphasize it. I would like to emphasize that, so that at least we can leave here knowing that many African countries have indeed made progress. They certainly have not failed. And if you go back to the mid-1990s, it is quite clear that there has been significant poverty reduction in many African countries by as much as 8 percentage points. And the rate of decrease in poverty has been similar in South Asia, including India, as a matter of fact. And indeed, a number of African countries have done better than India in poverty reduction. So as we leave here, I think that the image of Africa, certainly being downtrodden, all that, should be adjusted slightly. Thank you.
Thanks, Augustine. I should just point out that's Augustine Fosu, who has just led a major, wider project looking at success and the sources of success. I should just add that at home, late at night, what I'm now reading is psychology, and the latest psychology I'm reading emphasizes that you should focus on achievements rather than failures. So are we, by setting up failure, actually sort of doing the wrong thing? It's time to turn back to our panel. Jay.
Right. Well, first question. The instrument is not the final composite index. It is the entire collection of the final and all of its components. If you separate them out, you're losing information. Keep them all in the mix. Sure, one is used for one reason, for the first glance. Thereafter, you look deeply. So that's what I would respond to that comment. Secondly, is it too flexible? Should we let countries decide their own goals? Give me a break, okay? Countries should decide their own goals, and they are bloody well able to manipulate if they want. But I'll tell you one thing, that once you've put down a goal and you've said, this is where I'm at, you better meet it. And so think about it carefully. How would you manipulate? Gee, let's fix it so that it looks like we're doing well now. Okay, so we'll put more weight on the things we're doing well. But wait a minute, in the future it'll be hard to make increases. So there's double-edged swords. And these measures are quite robust when you change weights on things. And even when you add new data sources, amazingly enough, they're quite robust. If they're robust, it's harder to manipulate. So the answer is get people to put something down on paper, and then let's see. That's the important first step. Next, jobs, agreed. That's a very good observation, jobs and justice. In fact, as we saw, Colombia includes quality of jobs. That can be implemented, in fact. Paternalism. I would agree with the comment that one of the problems has been from on high down. The whole idea of this technology is to start down and come up, or at least to allow starting in the middle to go both ways, as opposed to starting at the top and only going down. And then finally, the comment by Augustine reminds me of using P1 rather than P0. I mean, we should be looking at something like an equivalent headcount, which would say that if the average poor person is 50 cents or 20 cents below the $1 a day, to keep it simple, then we'll consider that to be an average poor person. And therefore, as we increase 10 cents, that's half a person. Whether it's at the lower or the higher, we should at least count it as half. And right now, we don't count it as anything until it goes across. And so I think that there has to be a strong re-evaluation of the measure we use, headcount, versus the poverty gap measure, which is what we're talking about when we use equivalent headcount. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James.
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things, mainly about Paul's questions. One about, is setting floors to living standards kind of too low, too simple of a goal, and there's all these environmental and sustainability issues. I think that kind of gets back to what Charles is talking about, is there's so much variation out there that if we try, what Charles was saying, if we set the goals too high, these African countries are never going to make them. And so, kind of agreeing with what James said, every country sort of has to set their own goals ultimately. We can have these out there, and I kind of view these as the goals for the relatively poor countries in the world. we're not saying that the developed countries have completely solved all their problems and it's nirvana and everything's great. They all are going to look good on these goals, but there's still things to be working on, and every country is going to set their own goals and as countries progress. As far as the Arab Spring, actually there was one thing that I was going to say, but I didn't do it, which is that was suggested to me by my former boss at the World Bank, Manny Jimenez, which is for, say, teenage or maybe very young adults, being in school is a good thing, but also being work is okay. But this intermediate category of being unemployed, having neither being in school nor in work, maybe that should be a separate, I don't know if it's an education goal or something more general, but that may be something worth looking at, though I haven't really thought it through very well. Okay.
My colleague Justin Sandifer up there has been looking at submissions to the CSAE conference and tells me that if you look at what the non-African submissions are largely about, a lot of them are about institutions. If you look at tell me if I'm wrong, Justin, if you look at the African submissions, a lot more are about jobs. I think that may reflect sort of the kind of priorities that the MDGs ought to have if they are to be more southern focused and broader. And I absolutely agree with you, Paul, that we just have to move beyond only floors. I think floors remain important. I'd want them to be done differently, but I think floors remain important, but we have to move beyond. And we have to move beyond for at least two reasons. One is the sort of DAC to low OECD development assistance countries on the one hand, to low income on the other model of the original MDGs, if you will, or at least of MDG 8. By 2030, maybe 8% of the population of the world will live in low-income countries, and half of the people in high-income countries won't be in DAC economies. I mean, China and Brazil may be high-income by 2030. I mean, we're in a different world from the world we were. So, I mean, that's one reason. Most of the world just wouldn't be covered by a floors model and a model that involved high to low income. The other is global public good. I mean, not least, DAC countries today produce less than half of the greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. We really need, a global compact to deal with some of these things, not a high income, low income thing. And finally, just Professor Fose's point, and thank you very much for it. And I think it's really the message I'd want to hammer home. The last 10 years have probably been the most successful development decade Africa has ever had. I really hope that continues. And if and when it does, I want whatever replaces the MDGs to celebrate that, not knock it down.
Thanks very much. Now, we've had, that brings to a close what I think is a really superb panel on an absolutely of-the-moment subject. So first, let me just say thank you very much to all the panelists. As Charles ended by saying, the last 10 years have been Africa's most successful ever. I think it's also fair to say that the last 2 days have been CSAE's most successful conference ever. I speak as someone who bears absolutely zero responsibility for this. But I will take the very last tweet that came in, which was rather nice. It said, by the way, many compliments to the organisers of this conference. It's been running really well. And so I think it's an appropriate moment to turn to the guy who's actually been in charge of running the conference. So, James, over to you.
Some acknowledgements and some practical information, and I'll give you the practical information second so that you stay for the acknowledgements. So first, we need to thank the overwhelming turnout of graduate students, or postgrads as they're called here, who have been responsible for making sure you had a microphone, for having been responsible for making sure you were able to register, for being responsible for 1 million invisible tasks during this weekend, who came out en masse, and thank you. Without you, nothing. There are a couple of people who aren't here but who have made things run well this year, and I'm on camera, so you'll be able to see me. Thank you on the internet. To Richard and Martina, thank you for running things, thank you for communications, thank you for making sure Paul knows where he needs to be. To Martina specifically, we're sorry to see you move to another building, but it's great to have you still with us. Then there's been some people who've been around all weekend and have been making sure that you've been filmed correctly and have been making sure that the blogs have been working and have been doing a bunch of invisible tasks as well. Julia, Suzanne, Richard, and Gail, I don't think you're actually in the room, but there's wine sitting here that you can either collect from me in the next few minutes or that I can bring back to my office and give you guys tomorrow morning. And then last but not least, Rose Page has been basically running this whole show, and it's been amazing, and has been dealing with new requests we've never had before, and has been working around the clock, and has been indispensable, and has been teaching me how to do my job, and it is wonderful. So thank you to Rose. Practically, we're not feeding you. So, as the first thing I have to tell you, there is no dinner this evening, but Oxford is full of wonderful restaurants, and some of them are listed online. Most of them are in walking distance. If you just go out and wander, you'll find something if you all stop at the same place. None of you will be able to get a table. Second, we're not done yet. The World Bank is running a session tomorrow here at 9:30 in the morning where they want input on the New World Development Report. And so that is going to be very interesting. I encourage you all to come here. Please come next year because we'll have another one of these. And we can make next year even better than this year because we're going to send you a form via email asking for your feedback. Please get back to us and we can take into account all the things you want us to do. Thank you for coming. Please come next year.